Before we begin, a quick and important disclaimer. The following content is provided strictly for educational and entertainment purposes. It does not constitute legal, financial, or psychological advice. Divorce proceedings and family law vary significantly by jurisdiction, and the social dynamics discussed are based on broad historical trends and case studies, rather than individual guarantees. You are strongly encouraged to conduct your own due diligence and consult with qualified professionals, such as attorneys or licensed therapists, regarding your specific situation before making any life-altering decisions. In the next 60 minutes, your entire understanding of the American domestic landscape is going to shift. Imagine a man who has spent 20 years building a life. He has a mortgage in a quiet suburb, 2 children who look to him for guidance, and a social circle built entirely through the lens of his marriage. Then, with a single signature, that entire architecture collapses. While the legal system handles the division of assets, there is a far more silent, far more devastating division occurring: the dismantling of the male identity. Statistics suggest that in the United States, men are significantly more likely to experience a drop in social support and a sharp increase in isolation following a divorce. We are currently witnessing a cultural phenomenon where the American man, once the perceived pillar of the household, becomes a transient figure in his own story. This is not just about who gets the house or how the retirement accounts are split. This is about the invisible man syndrome that permeates modern U.S. culture. Why is it that, despite decades of social progress, the cultural script for a divorced man remains one of displacement, silence, and a sudden loss of purpose? This video is a deep dive masterclass designed to solve a specific, painful problem for the American audience: the lack of a roadmap for navigating the profound cultural fallout of a broken marriage. If you are watching this, you are likely looking for more than just legal tips. You are looking to understand why your social circle vanished overnight. You are looking to understand why the provider role you were told to inhabit suddenly feels like a liability. We are going to break down the historical trends that led us here, the psychological traps that catch men in the aftermath, and the case studies that reveal the potential outcomes for those who fail to recognize the cultural shift happening around them. By the end of this series, you will have a comprehensive understanding of the structural forces at play, allowing you to move from a state of reactive survival to one of proactive reconstruction. To understand the cultural impact of divorce for men in the USA today, we must first look at the massive shift in the social contract of marriage. For most of the 20th century, marriage in America was an economic and social fortress. It was the primary vehicle for wealth accumulation and social standing. When the no-fault divorce revolution began in the late 1960s, starting with California in 1969, it fundamentally altered the leverage within the domestic unit. Historically, divorce required a showing of fault, adultery, abandonment, or cruelty. When that requirement was removed, the cultural perception of marriage shifted from a permanent contract to a conditional consensus. For men, this meant that the traditional provider role, which was built on the assumption of lifelong domestic stability, suddenly became a high-risk investment. Consider the provider trap. In American culture, a man's value is often tied directly to his utility. He is the protector, the earner, and the fixer. When a divorce occurs, the legal system often converts this utility into a monthly payment, but the cultural system removes the role. This creates a vacuum of identity. According to historical trends observed in sociology, many men find that their entire social life was outsourced to their spouse. In the United States, women are statistically more likely to maintain the social calendar, manage relationships with extended family, and foster community ties. When the marriage ends, the man doesn't just lose a partner, he loses his entire social infrastructure. He finds himself in an empty apartment, realizing that his friends were actually his wife's friends' husbands. This isolation is a primary driver of the second-hand displacement that men face, where they become spectators in a life they helped build. Let's look at a case study of what we call the suburban erasure. Imagine a 45-year-old professional in a mid-sized U.S. city. He has spent 15 years coaching Little League and attending neighborhood barbecues. Post-divorce, the cultural momentum in many American suburbs tends to favor the primary residence. If the mother remains in the family home, which historical data suggests is a common outcome to maintain stability for the children, the father is the one who moves to a rental property or a different school district. This physical displacement leads to a cultural displacement. He is no longer the dad on the corner. He is the visitor who picks up the kids on alternating weekends. This shift from resident to visitor has profound psychological impacts. often leading to a sense of disenfranchisement that the legal documents never mention. Furthermore, we must address the stoicism tax. There is a pervasive cultural expectation in the US that men should take it on the chin. While there are thousands of resources, support groups, and cultural narratives surrounding the empowered divorcee, the narrative for the divorced man is often one of quiet on, or conversely, the midlife crisis trope. This lack of a healthy cultural script forces many men into a state of performance masculinity, where they pretend to be fine while their internal world is in shambles. Case studies in mental health suggest that this suppression leads to higher rates of substance abuse and a significant decline in physical health among divorced men in the US compared to their married or never married counterparts. The cultural impact also extends to the financial identity. In the US, the self-made man is a powerful myth. When a man's assets are liquidated or his income is heavily garnished to maintain a secondary household, it isn't just a financial hit, it's an assault on his sense of achievement. We see potential outcomes where men, feeling they can never win again, disengage from the workforce or lose the ambition that once defined them. They see their labor as being decoupled from their own benefit or the benefit of a home they no longer live in. This labor alienation is a massive, yet rarely discussed, byproduct of the American divorce experience. In this deep dive, we are also going to explore the fatherhood identity crisis. In the United States, the concept of the deadbeat dad is a powerful cultural boogeyman. Because this archetype is so prevalent, many men who are actually deeply involved fathers find themselves overcompensating or living in fear of being labeled as such. The cultural impact here is the defensive parenting style, where men feel they have to audition for the right to be a parent in the eyes of the community and the law. This creates a high-stress environment that prevents genuine bonding and turns every weekend visit into a high-stakes performance. As we move forward in this series, we will examine how these historical trends have created a unique pressure cooker for the modern American male. We will look at how the digital age has made this even more complex, with social media acting as a theater for one's perceived failure or success post-divorce. We are going to deconstruct the alimony myth versus the alimony reality, and how the mere threat of it shapes the behavior of men long before a divorce is even on the horizon. This is about the preemptive guarding that many men now engage in, which ironically can lead to the very domestic friction they are trying to avoid. The problem we are solving today is the lack of language for this experience. Most men going through this feel like they are the first person to ever experience this specific brand of loneliness and identity loss. By laying out these case studies and historical trends, we are giving you the vocabulary to understand that your experience is a predictable outcome of a specific cultural and legal architecture. You aren't failing. You are navigating a system that was not designed with your long-term emotional or social integration in mind. In the parts to follow, we will go even deeper into the specific financial, legal, and parental hurdles, but it all starts here, with the realization that the cultural impact of divorce is a total transformation of the self. We are going to show you how to map that transformation so you don't lose your way in the process. To understand how this transformation manifests in real time, let us look at the immediate physical and psychological displacement that occurs during the separation phase in the United States. Imagine a man named David. It is 2026, and David is a 42-year-old project manager living in a suburb of Charlotte, North Carolina. For 15 years, David's identity has been anchored to a 4-bedroom colonial house, a specific commuting route, and a localized reputation as a reliable neighbor and father. When the decision to divorce is finalized, David finds himself in what sociologists often call the transitional void. In many American case studies, the cultural expectation is that the man will be the one to vacate the primary residence to maintain stability for the children. This one act of moving out triggers a cascade of cultural consequences that go far beyond simple logistics. David moves into a 1-bedroom apartment 10 miles away. Suddenly, his environment no longer reflects his history or his achievements. In the United States, your home is often your primary signifier of adult success. By moving into a temporary, sterile space, David experiences a sharp decline in his perceived social status. This is not just a personal feeling, it is a cultural reaction. When neighbors see David's car gone from the driveway, the narrative shifts from David the father to David the outsider. Historical trends suggest that this physical distancing often leads to a rapid erosion of social capital. David is no longer included in the neighborhood group chats about school board meetings or local security. He has been physically and digitally removed from the community he helped fund and maintain. This leads us to the concept of the secondary parent syndrome. In the US, the legal and social framework often defaults to a primary versus secondary caregiver model, even in states that theoretically favor joint custody. Potential outcomes for men in this situation often involve becoming a visitor in their own children's lives. For David, the Wednesday night dinners and alternating weekends turn parenting into a scheduled event rather than a lived experience. This creates a profound psychological disconnect. 2026, with the high-speed nature of American life, if you are not present for the mundane moments, the homework struggles, the late-night snacks, the morning rushes, you lose the cultural currency of being a central figure in the household. David begins to feel like an ATM with a visiting pass. He is still working the same 45 hours a week to provide for a household he no longer inhabits, while his own standard of living in his apartment takes a significant hit. Let us examine the data regarding the standard of living gap. While it is a common cultural trope in the US that men maintain more wealth post-divorce, recent case studies focusing on the middle class reveal a more complex reality. The cost of maintaining two households instead of one is a massive financial drain. In 2026, with the cost of housing and services continuing to rise in major US hubs, many men find that their disposable income vanishes. They are often paying a mortgage on a home they do not live in while simultaneously paying market rate rent for their new residence. This financial strangulation has a cultural impact. The man can no longer afford the hobbies, the social outings, or the community contributions that previously defined his social standing. He becomes socially invisible because he can no longer afford the price of admission to his former life. Now imagine the impact on David's professional life. In the American workplace, there is an unspoken expectation of performance. A man going through a divorce is often expected to keep his personal life entirely separate from his professional output. However, the cultural weight of losing his domestic base often leads to what is known as the productivity tax. Case studies of American professionals show that the cognitive load of navigating legal battles, managing a new solitary life, and dealing with the grief of a lost identity leads to a higher risk of career stagnation. Because David's identity was so heavily tied to being the provider, the realization that his labor is now disconnected from his immediate presence at home can lead to a crisis of motivation. Why work the extra hours if the reward is an empty apartment? We must also address the social death of the coupled friend. In the United States, adult social life is predominantly organized around couples. Dinner parties, double dates, and family vacations are the currency of suburban socialization. When David becomes a single man, he often finds that he is no longer invited to these gatherings. It is not necessarily out of malice from his friends, but rather a lack of cultural fit. A single man in a room of couples can create a perceived social awkwardness or a reminder of the fragility of other marriages. Historical trends indicate that men are significantly less likely than women to reach out and form new social bonds post-divorce. David waits for the phone to ring, but the invitations stop coming. This isolation is a major factor in the decline of male mental health in the US, as the social feedback loop that reinforced David's value has been severed. Furthermore, the digital landscape of 2026 adds a new layer of complexity. Social media algorithms are designed to show us what we are missing. David scrolls through his feed and sees his children at a birthday party he wasn't invited to, his former spouse moving on with a new social circle. This digital exclusion reinforces his physical displacement. In previous decades, a man might have been able to achieve some level of distance, but today the cultural impact of divorce is constantly refreshed in the palm of your hand. The psychological toll of being a spectator to your own life via a screen cannot be overstated. It creates a state of perpetual mourning that prevents the reconstruction of the self. Consider the case of Mark, a 50-year-old in Seattle. Mark's divorce happened after 25 years of marriage. He finds that his relationship with his adult children is now filtered through the lens of the divorce. In the US, there is often a cultural pressure for children to take sides or to act as mediators. Mark feels he has to constantly defend his character to avoid being cast as the villain in the family narrative. This defensive posture is exhausting and changes the nature of the paternal bond. Instead of being a guide, he becomes a defendant. This is a common potential outcome when the cultural script of the divorce focuses on finding a party to blame, rather than recognizing the systemic failure of the relationship. As we look at these layers of displacement, physical, financial, professional, and social, we see that the American man is facing a total systemic overhaul. It is not just about the end of a relationship. It is about the collapse of a lifestyle and the identity that supported it. The cultural impact is a transition from a position of integrated authority to one of isolated observation. However, understanding these mechanics is the first step toward building a new framework. If you can see the traps before you step in them, you can begin to navigate the terrain with more clarity. But what happens when the isolation moves from the social sphere into the biological realm? What is the actual physical cost of this cultural displacement? In the next part, we are going to dive into the silent epidemic that is sweeping through the population of divorced men in America. We will examine the startling data on health outcomes, the decline in life expectancy, and the specific biological markers that shift when a man loses his domestic anchor. We will look at why the U.S. healthcare system is often ill-equipped to handle the specific needs of men in this transition, and how the lack of a social safety net creates a dangerous health crisis that no one is talking about. Prepare yourself because we are moving from the social impact to the literal fight for survival. The biological reality of divorce for the American man is a silent, creeping crisis that often predates the legal filing, but accelerates with terrifying speed once the household splits. We must address the phenomenon of the health gatekeeper. In the United States, historical trends indicate in approximately 70% of heterosexual marriages, the female spouse acts as the primary health manager for the household. She is the one who schedules the annual physicals, monitors dietary intake, notices the unusual mole, and insists on a doctor's visit for a persistent cough. When the domestic unit dissolves, the man does not just lose a partner, he loses his outsourced biological maintenance system. Imagine James, a 50-year-old software architect in Columbus, Ohio. It is 2026, and James has been divorced for 18 months. During his 24-year marriage, his health was a shared responsibility. Now, living in a modern condo in the city, James is subject to the performance of health rather than the maintenance of it. He goes to the gym to maintain his appearance for the new dating market, but his internal metrics are crashing. Without the subtle daily cues of a partner, James has defaulted to a high-sodium, highly processed diet that fits his new erratic work and parenting schedule. Case studies in American men's health show that post-divorce, men experience a significant spike in blood pressure and a higher risk of cardiovascular events. For James, this manifests as a silent increase in his resting heart rate, fueled by a constant state of low-level cortisol. This leads us to the science of the allostatic load. This is the wear and tear on the body which accumulates as an individual is exposed to repeated or chronic stress. In the US, the divorce process is designed to be adversarial, often stretching out for 12 to 24 months in contested cases. This means a man is living in a state of fight or flight for hundreds of days. This chronic stress floods the system with cortisol and adrenaline. Under normal circumstances, these hormones help us survive immediate danger. Under the circumstances of a prolonged American divorce, they begin to degrade the arterial walls and suppress the immune system. We see potential outcomes where men, previously healthy, suddenly develop autoimmune issues or chronic inflammatory conditions within 2 years of their separation. Furthermore, we have to look at the mortality gap. Data from the early 2020s, trending into 2026, reveals a stark reality. Divorced men in the United States have a significantly higher mortality rate than married men, and even a higher rate than divorced women. One major factor is the decline in sleep quality. Sleep is the body's primary restorative mechanism, yet the cultural impact of moving from a shared bed to a solitary environment often results in chronic insomnia or fragmented sleep. For James in Ohio, the quiet of his new apartment is not peaceful, it is a vacuum. The lack of the physiological regulation that comes from co-sleeping with a long-term partner, the synchronization of breathing and heart rates, leaves his nervous system on high alert. Chronic sleep deprivation in divorced men is a direct precursor to the development of type 2 diabetes and cognitive decline. We also need to discuss the silent epidemic of substance as a coping mechanism. In U.S. culture, the divorced man at the bar is a cliché, but the 2026 reality is more clinical. We see an increase in the use of prescription stimulants to maintain work performance during the day and sedatives or alcohol to turn off at night. Because many men in the U.S. feel a cultural pressure to remain stoic and productive, they use these substances to bridge the gap between their crumbling internal world and their required professional output. Case studies show that this chemical bridging often leads to a sudden health collapse or a significant decline in liver function. The American healthcare system is poorly equipped to catch this because men are less likely to disclose the emotional root of their physical symptoms to a general practitioner. Consider the identity health connection. In the United States, a man's health is often tied to his sense of purpose. When a man like James loses his role as the daily protector and provider within the home, his subconscious begins to deprioritize self-preservation. If he feels his best years are behind him, or that his labor is merely serving a legal settlement, the motivation to engage in preventative health measures vanishes. This is the despair reflex. It is why we see a decline in dental hygiene, a cessation of regular exercise, and a disregard for safety protocols in hobbies or work. The cultural impact is a transition from being a man with a future to a man with a history. The medical community in the U.S. is beginning to recognize divorce-induced trauma as a specific health risk, yet the outreach remains minimal. Most men are left to navigate the biological fallout alone. They do not realize that the brain fog they feel is actually neuroinflammation from chronic stress, or that their back pain is a physical manifestation of the literal weight of their new financial and social burdens. Step by step, the body begins to reflect the fractured state of the life. First the sleep goes, then the diet shifts. Next, the social isolation leads to a lack of exterior health checks. Finally, the chronic stress triggers a dormant or new physical ailment. This biological tax is exacerbated by the housing health link. In 2026, many divorced men are moving into lower quality housing or environments that lack the health-promoting features of their former family homes, such as a full kitchen, a quiet neighborhood, or proximity to green spaces. The environmental shift is a physical stressor that the body must constantly adapt to. James, for instance, now lives in a high-traffic area where the noise pollution further disrupts his already fragile sleep cycle. What we are witnessing is a literal weathering of the male population. The cultural impact of divorce is written into the DNA and the arteries of the American man. It is a transformation that is as much about the cells as it is about the soul. But there is another layer to this survival story that is perhaps even more complex and controversial. While the body is fighting to stay afloat, the man's relationship with the next generation, his children, is undergoing a radical state-sanctioned transformation. How does the American legal system's view of the best interests of the child actually clash with the biological and cultural needs of the father? In the next part, we are going to tear back the curtain on the custody architecture. We will examine the hidden incentives within the U.S. family court system, the reality of parental alienation in the digital age of 2026, and why the every other weekend model is being criticized by developmental psychologists as a relic of a bygone era. We will look at how the state becomes a silent third partner in the parenting relationship, and what that means for the long-term psychological health of both the man and his children. The battle for health is only the beginning. The battle for the future is where the stakes truly escalate. The transition from a full-time parent to a schedule-compliant visitor is perhaps the most jarring cultural shift a man experiences in the American divorce landscape. In the United States, the legal architecture of custody is built upon the best interests of the child standard, a term that sounds balanced but often operates within a framework of historical trends that favor a primary and secondary caregiver model. For the American man in 2026, this system often feels like a forced demotion. Imagine Marcus, a 38-year-old middle manager in Atlanta, Georgia. Before his divorce in early 2026, Marcus was the parent who handled the morning drop-offs, coached the Saturday soccer games, and was the primary disciplinarian for his two young daughters. However, as he enters the family court system, he encounters the custody architecture, a complex web of legal precedents and social expectations that prioritize the status quo of the household, which frequently places the mother in the role of the primary residential parent. Marcus is introduced to the concept of the temporary parenting plan, which in many U.S. jurisdictions still defaults to the every other weekend and one evening a week model. This model, which rose to prominence in the 1980s, is increasingly criticized by developmental psychologists in 2026 for being a relic of a different era. The cultural impact on Marcus is immediate. He goes from 365 days of parenting to approximately 80 to 90 days a year. Case studies on father-child bonding suggest that this schedule destroys the mundane intimacy required for a healthy relationship. Marcus is no longer there for the Tuesday night math homework or the Thursday morning scramble for clean laundry. He becomes what culture labels a Disneyland dad, a man who feels he must jam a month's worth of fun and bonding into 48 hours to keep his children's affection. This creates a high-pressure environment for both the father and the children, leading to potential outcomes where the children view the father's house as a vacation spot rather than a home, ultimately eroding his authority and influence. We must also examine the hidden incentives within the U.S. family court system, specifically regarding Title 4D of the Social Security Act. This is a federal program that provides funding to states to encourage the collection of child support. While the intent is to ensure children are provided for, historical trends show that the formulas used to calculate support are often tied directly to the number of overnights each parent has. In 2026, this creates a cultural friction where custody time is not just about parenting. It is about the transfer of wealth. For a man like Marcus, every day he fights for in court is seen by the system as a day he is trying to reduce his financial obligation, rather than a father trying to be present for his children. This creates a defensive posture in the courtroom that poisons the co-parenting relationship from the very start. Furthermore, the digital age of 2026 has introduced a new, more insidious form of displacement: parental alienation via technology. In the past, alienation required physical gatekeeping. Today, it happens in the palm of a child's hand. Marcus finds that when his daughters are with him, they are constantly receiving texts and calls from the other household, or they are being tracked via GPS-enabled smartwatches. This digital tether prevents Marcus from establishing a distinct domestic culture in his new home. Case studies reveal that high-conflict divorces in the U.S. now frequently involve the use of parenting apps as surveillance tools. The state becomes a silent third partner in these interactions, with every message and GPS ping potentially being entered as evidence in a future modification hearing. Let us look at a specific scenario involving the right of first refusal. This is a common clause in U.S. parenting plans stating that if one parent is unavailable for a certain period, say 4 hours, they must offer the other parent the opportunity to take the children before calling a babysitter. While this sounds logical, in practice it often becomes a tool for post-divorce control. Imagine Marcus wants to go to a professional development seminar on a Saturday afternoon during his scheduled time. He is legally obligated to notify his former spouse. This requirement forces him to remain under a level of domestic supervision that most adults find stifling. It prevents him from building a new independent life and keeps him tethered to the schedules and whims of his previous household. The psychological toll of this state-sanctioned parenting is profound. Men in the U.S. often report feeling like they are on probation. They are living under a court order that dictates when they can see their children, where they can take them, and how they must communicate with their former partner. This is the state as the third parent. If Marcus misses a payment due to a clerical error in 2026, he faces the threat of license suspension or incarceration. Yet if he is denied his scheduled time with his children, the legal recourse is often slow, expensive, and difficult to enforce. This asymmetry in the American legal system sends a clear cultural message. A father's financial utility is primary, but his physical presence is secondary. Case studies in the mid-2020s show that this disenfranchised fatherhood leads to a phenomenon known as the retreat. Some men, feeling they can never win in a system that views them as a visitor in a bank account, begin to pull away. They miss visits, they stop calling, and they eventually fade into the background of their children's lives. This is not usually because they do not care, but because the pain of the visitor role is too great to bear. The cultural impact of this retreat is devastating for the next generation. Data continues to show that children in father-absent homes in the USA face higher risks of behavioral issues, lower educational attainment, and a higher likelihood of future relationship instability. To counteract this, we see the rise of the parenting coordinator in 2026. This is a court-appointed professional who acts as a referee for high-conflict parents. While this can help reduce direct friction, it adds yet another layer of bureaucracy and cost to the man's life. Every decision, from which doctor the child visits to what extracurriculars they join, becomes a three-way negotiation involving a paid professional. Marcus finds himself paying hundreds of dollars an hour just to argue for his right to sign his daughter up for a coding camp. This deep dive into the custody architecture reveals that the American man is fighting a war on two fronts. He is fighting to maintain his relationship with his children, while simultaneously navigating a legal system that was designed for a different social era. The potential outcomes of this struggle define the next 20 years of his life. If he manages to stay engaged despite the hurdles, he preserves his legacy. If he falls into the traps of alienation or retreat, he loses his future. But the challenges do not stop at the courtroom door. There is a silent, often overlooked factor that dictates whether a man survives the cultural impact of divorce: the shifting landscape of his professional and financial survival in an economy that is increasingly hostile to the single, divorced earner. How does the 2026 U.S. economy specifically penalize the divorced man? And why is the concept of the alimony trap still a very real, very dangerous possibility in a world that claims to be equal? In the next part, we are going to break down the financial mechanics of the clean break, the reality of the two-household tax, and why your career may be the next thing to face the chopping block. We will look at how the American workforce views the divorced man, and why your boss might be your biggest liability. The transition from a dual-income or even a stable single-income household to the fractured financial reality of 2026 is where the cultural impact of divorce hits the American man with the force of a structural collapse. In the United States, we operate under a system that assumes a certain level of economic efficiency within the family unit. When that unit breaks, the efficiency doesn't just halve. It evaporates, leaving a massive deficit that the man is often culturally and legally expected to bridge. Imagine Robert, a 48-year-old senior systems engineer in Austin, Texas. In early 2026, Robert is earning a respectable salary of $160,000 a year. For 2 decades, that income, combined with his spouse's part-time earnings, supported a lifestyle that included a mortgage on a $500,000 home, 2 reliable vehicles, a college fund for his teenager, and a consistent contribution to his 401k. Upon the filing of the divorce, Robert enters the reality of the two-household tax. This is a phenomenon where the same amount of capital that previously funded one high-quality life must now fund 2 separate, lower-quality lives. In the current 2026 U.S. housing market, with interest rates and property taxes at historic levels, Robert finds himself paying the mortgage on the family home where he no longer resides, while simultaneously trying to secure a rental in a safe neighborhood that is large enough to accommodate his son during his scheduled visitation. Historical trends in the U.S. legal system reveal that the man is frequently designated as the obligor in these scenarios. Robert is not just paying for his own survival. He is subsidizing a lifestyle he is no longer a part of. This creates a psychological state known as financial disenfranchisement. In Robert's case, after the court-ordered temporary support and the mortgage payment, his take-home pay is effectively slashed by 60%. He is working 45 to 50 hours a week at a high-stress job. Yet he is living in a 2-bedroom apartment, eating pre-packaged meals, and driving an older vehicle to save on insurance and fuel. The cultural impact here is a massive blow to the self-made man narrative. Robert feels like he is a passenger in his own career, where his labor is being harvested to maintain a past he cannot return to, rather than building a future he can look forward to. Now let us examine why your career might be the next thing to face the chopping block. In the American professional landscape of 2026, there is a hidden bias against the divorced man. We must look at the reliability factor. Management in high-stakes industries prioritizes stability and predictability. When Robert's divorce becomes public knowledge at the office, his value as a candidate for the next major promotion often undergoes a silent re-evaluation. His superiors may see the frequent calls from his attorney, the occasional need to leave early for a custody exchange, and the visible signs of chronic stress as indicators of a liability. There is an unspoken concern that he is distracted, or worse, that his legal entanglements might lead to a garnishment of wages or a search for a more lucrative, albeit riskier, position elsewhere. Case studies from corporate HR departments suggest that men going through high-conflict divorces in the USA experience a sharp decline in their productivity metrics during the first 24 months. This is the productivity tax. For Robert, this manifests as brain fog during critical design reviews or a lack of patience with junior staff. In a 2026 economy that is increasingly automated and competitive, these lapses are not just personal failings, they are career-ending vulnerabilities. Robert is in a catch-22. He needs the high-paying job more than ever to meet his legal and financial obligations, yet the very process of fulfilling those obligations is undermining his ability to perform at the level required to keep the job. Furthermore, we must discuss the 401k harvest and the destruction of the retirement dream. In the U.S., retirement accounts are often considered marital property. Under a Qualified Domestic Relations Order, or QDRO, a judge can order that a significant portion of Robert's retirement nest egg be transferred to his former spouse. 2026, with a compounding interest of 20 years at stake, this is not just a transfer of cash. It is a transfer of time. Robert is effectively being told that the last decade of his labor has been erased. The potential outcomes for men in this situation include being forced to work well into their 70s, as they no longer have the luxury of a 20-year horizon to rebuild their wealth. This wealth erasure is a primary driver of the bitterness and disillusionment seen in the American male population post-divorce. Then there is the reality of the alimony trap, or what many states now call spousal maintenance. While the cultural narrative suggests that alimony is a relic of the past, in many U.S. jurisdictions in 2026, it remains a common feature of long-term marriages where there is a significant income disparity. Robert finds himself in a situation where he is legally required to maintain the marital standard of living for his ex-spouse, even if it means his own standard of living drops below what he experienced as a junior engineer in his 20s. This is the maintenance of a ghost. He is paying for a phantom household, and if he fails to do so, the state has the power to seize his assets, suspend his professional licenses, or even incarcerate him. This looming threat of state-sanctioned force creates a perpetual state of low-level anxiety that colors every professional decision he makes. We must also consider the case of the small business owner. Imagine if Robert wasn't an employee, but the owner of a boutique engineering firm. In the U.S., the valuation of a business during a divorce is a battlefield. The court may determine that the business has a certain value, and Robert may be forced to buy out his spouse's interest. In 2026, with credit being tight and valuations being volatile, this often requires Robert to take on massive debt or sell off essential assets of the company just to settle the divorce. He is essentially being forced to sabotage his own creation to pay for its dissolution. This financial and professional erosion is the silent killer of the male identity in America. When a man's ability to provide is compromised, and his life's work is treated as a divisible commodity, his connection to the broader social order begins to fray. He becomes a mercenary of his own labor, working for a settlement rather than a legacy. The cultural impact is a generation of men who are financially crippled and professionally cautious, avoiding the very risks that drive innovation and growth. But what happens when this financial pressure meets the shifting landscape of modern dating? If Robert tries to rebuild, he enters a 2026 dating market that is fundamentally different from the one he left 20 years ago. In the next part, we are going to dive into the digital jungle of the post-divorce dating scene. We will look at the rise of the background check culture, the impact of your financial status on your digital desirability, and why the 2026 dating algorithms are often rigged against the divorced father. We will explore the phenomenon of the transitional relationship, and why so many men fall into the trap of the rebound, only to find themselves in an even more precarious position. Prepare for a deep dive into the world of algorithmic attraction and the high cost of a second chance. The transition into the 2026 American dating market for a divorced man is not merely a change in relationship status. It is a full-scale immersion into a data-driven, hyper-scrutinized digital jungle that operates on rules he likely does not understand. Imagine Michael, a 45-year-old architect in Denver, Colorado. When Michael last dated in the mid-2000s, the process was organic, based on proximity, mutual friends, and face-to-face chemistry. Today, as he steps out of a 15-year marriage, he discovers that the landscape has been completely re-engineered by algorithms, social credit, and a pervasive culture of background checking that treats every new man as a potential risk until proven otherwise. For Michael, the first cultural shock is the algorithmic barrier. In the 2026 dating ecosystem, apps are no longer simple card stacks. They are sophisticated matching engines that utilize predictive modeling to determine a user's desirability. Historical trends indicate that divorced men often carry an invisible penalty in these systems. If Michael's profile mentions he is a father or if his lifestyle photos suggest a more settled, domestic history, the algorithm may categorize him into a lower-tier visibility pool. Case studies in digital sociology suggest that users often filter for never married or no children, effectively making Michael invisible to a significant portion of the dating population before he even says hello. This is the digital erasure of the divorced father, where his most profound life experience, raising children, becomes a filtered-out liability in the quest for a new partner. Then comes the phenomenon of the social audit. Before Michael even secures a first date, he is likely being vetted through vast, decentralized networks of female-led safety groups. In 2026, these groups have evolved from simple forums into highly organized databases where men's names, photos, and past dating histories are shared and scrutinized. If Michael's divorce was high conflict, or if there is any public record of his legal battles, this information is often surfaced and discussed by strangers. This creates a preemptive reputation that Michael cannot control. A potential outcome for many men in this position is the sudden ghosting that occurs mid-conversation. Often, it is because a background search or a group chat inquiry returned a detail about his past that was interpreted through a lens of caution. The financial component of dating in 2026 adds another layer of complexity. In a high inflation, high cost of living U.S. economy, financial transparency has become a dating prerequisite. Apps now often have implicit markers for financial stability. For Michael, who is currently paying child support and potentially alimony, his disposable income for dating is significantly lower than that of his never-married peers. This leads to the wallet-casting trap. If he tries to maintain the high-spending dating style of a successful 45-year-old architect, he accelerates his financial depletion. If he is honest about his budget, he may be viewed as low value by the very demographic he is trying to attract. Case studies of divorced men show a recurring pattern where they overextend themselves financially in the first year of dating to prove they are still players in the market, leading to a secondary financial crisis just as their divorce settlement is settling in. We must also analyze the rebound or transitional relationship trap. In the United States, there is a cultural narrative that the best way to get over someone is to get under someone else. For Michael, the sudden silence of his empty condo is deafening. This physiological and psychological craving for companionship often leads men into safe harbor relationships. These are partnerships formed not out of genuine compatibility, but out of a desperate need to outsource the emotional labor of the divorce. Michael might find a woman who is nurturing and supportive, only to realize 6 months later that he has essentially recreated the domestic dynamics of his marriage without doing the necessary internal work. The danger here is not just emotional, it is legal and financial. In many U.S. jurisdictions in 2026, cohabitation, even without marriage, can have significant impacts on alimony payments or even future asset claims. If Michael moves a new partner into his space too quickly, he might be inadvertently triggering a modification of support hearing. Historical trends show that many men, in their rush to feel normal again, bypass the solitary reconstruction phase that is vital for long-term stability. They jump from the frying pan of a failed marriage into the fire of a complicated, premature domestic partnership. Let us look at a case study of algorithmic attraction gone wrong. Michael matches with someone who seems perfect, but the interaction is mediated by a 2026 dating assistant, AI. The AI handles the small talk, schedules the date, and even suggests conversation topics based on Michael's data profile. This creates a performative connection. When Michael finally meets the woman in person, the data debt comes due. He cannot live up to the polished AI-assisted version of himself. This leads to a cycle of dating fatigue, where men feel they are constantly auditioning for a role they can't possibly fill. The cultural impact is a growing sense of cynicism and a retreat into passive participation, where men keep the apps open but stop putting in genuine effort, further degrading the dating pool for everyone. Furthermore, we must address the paternal gatekeeping that occurs in the dating world. In 2026, the question of when to introduce a new partner to the children is a cultural minefield. Michael faces pressure from his former spouse, his new partner, and his own guilt. If he introduces someone too early, he risks destabilizing his children and providing ammunition for a custody challenge. If he waits too long, his new partner may feel like a secret or a secondary priority. This scheduling friction is a primary reason why many post-divorce relationships in the U.S. fail within the first year. The man is caught between two worlds, and in his attempt to satisfy both, he often ends up satisfying neither. Step by step, the divorced man in 2026 must learn to navigate this. First, he must secure his digital footprint. This involves auditing his social media, understanding the public records of his divorce, and preparing for the inevitable background checks. Second, he must define his financial boundary, ensuring that his dating life does not compromise his long-term recovery. Third, and most importantly, he must resist the urgency of companionship. The cultural impact of divorce often leaves a man feeling expired, but the rush to renew his status through a new relationship is a high-risk strategy with potential outcomes that include a second, even more devastating legal entanglement. What Michael doesn't realize is that while he is focused on the dating apps, a much larger shadow divorce is taking place in his social and professional circles. His reputation is being managed and potentially dismantled by people he hasn't spoken to in years. How do the whisper networks of a mid-sized U.S. city determine a man's future after the papers are signed? In the next part, we are going to explore the social execution of the divorced man. We will look at how your mutual friends actually make their decisions, the reality of the professional blacklist, and why the truth of your divorce matters less than the narrative that takes hold in your community. We will dive into the mechanics of social survival and how to protect your name when the court of public opinion opens its doors. The battle for your heart is one thing. The battle for your name is where the real war begins. The social execution of the American man post-divorce is rarely a sudden event. It is a systematic, often invisible erosion of his standing within the community he once helped anchor. Imagine Anthony, a 46-year-old senior executive at a major insurance firm in Indianapolis. It is 2026, and Anthony has just finalized a high-asset divorce after 22 years of marriage. In the eyes of the law, the assets are divided and the paperwork is filed. But in the court of public opinion, which in Anthony's world consists of the local country club, his high-end church community, and a network of professional peers, the trial is only just beginning. To understand Anthony's predicament, we must analyze the concept of narrative momentum. In the United States, social circles operate on a scarcity of information and an abundance of assumptions. Historical trends suggest that the spouse who initiates the social framing of the divorce often gains what sociologists call social custody of the mutual friend group. Because Anthony was focused on the logistics of the legal battle and maintaining his professional output, he neglected the social front. While he remained silent to maintain a sense of decorum, a narrative was being constructed in his absence. This narrative doesn't need to be based on facts. It only needs to be consistent. By the time Anthony attempts to engage with his old social circle, he finds that he has been cast in a role he didn't audition for. He is no longer the reliable executive. He is the man whose personal failures are whispered about over cocktails. This leads us to the mechanics of the whisper network. In 2026, this network is no longer confined to neighborhood gossip. It is digitized and amplified. Case studies show that apps like Nextdoor, local Facebook groups, and specialized vetting platforms have become the primary tools for social execution. Anthony finds that his reputation is being managed by people he hasn't spoken to in years. When a mutual friend sees a post or receives a text that vaguely alludes to toxic behavior or instability, the psychological effect on the group is immediate. People in high-stakes social environments in the US are risk-averse. They do not want to be associated with someone who is perceived as a liability. Anthony experiences the silent uninviting. He isn't explicitly told he is no longer welcome. He simply stops receiving the calendar invites for the charity galas, the golf outings, and the holiday parties. Furthermore, we must examine the professional blacklist. In a mid-sized city like Indianapolis, the line between personal reputation and professional standing is non-existent. Anthony's career in insurance is built on the perception of stability and long-term risk management. When the whisper network labels him as unstable or compromised due to his divorce, his clients begin to take notice. We see potential outcomes where long-term clients suddenly move their accounts to a competitor, citing a need for a fresh perspective. His colleagues, sensing the shift in the wind, begin to distance themselves to protect their own careers. This is the reputational tax that the legal system never accounts for. Anthony is paying for his divorce not just with his bank account, but with the professional capital he spent decades accumulating. Consider the social credit reality of 2026. In the US, your ability to move through high-end social spaces is increasingly dependent on a vibe check that is essentially a decentralized social credit score. If Anthony attempts to join a new club or even a high-end dating service, he is subject to a background check that goes far beyond a criminal record. It includes a digital sentiment analysis of his online presence and the presence of his name in "Are we dating the same guy?" style groups or local community forums. If the narrative of his divorce is negative, his social credit drops, making it increasingly difficult to rebuild a life that matches his previous status. He is effectively trapped in a lower social stratum, regardless of his actual behavior or character. Step by step, the social erosion follows a predictable path. First, there is the neutrality phase, where friends claim they aren't taking sides but gradually stop calling. Second is the narrative crystallization, where a single version of the divorce story becomes the accepted truth among the group. Third is the professional spillover, where the social narrative begins to affect business relationships and career opportunities. Finally, there is social displacement, where the man finds himself in a new environment, often far removed from his former community, forced to start from scratch with a fraction of his previous social resources. Let us look at a specific scenario involving Saturday morning soccer. For years, Anthony was a fixture on the sidelines, chatting with other fathers and organizing post-game lunches. Post-divorce, this environment becomes a theater of exclusion. When he arrives to see his son play, the other fathers, men he considered friends, offer polite, clipped greetings before moving to the other side of the field. Wives, who were once part of his broader social life, provide a wall of icy silence. Anthony is physically present but socially invisible. This sideline ostracization is a powerful tool of social control in American suburban life. It reinforces the idea that once the domestic unit is broken, the man's membership in the community is revoked. The psychological impact of this social execution is what we call identity fragmentation. Anthony's sense of self was tied to his role as a pillar of the community. When that community turns its back on him, his internal mirror breaks. He begins to question his own worth and his own history. This is where the potential outcomes become dangerous. Men in this position often fall into a cycle of defensive isolation, where they stop trying to connect altogether to avoid the pain of rejection. This isolation further fuels the negative narrative, as his absence is interpreted as a sign of guilt, further instability. But there is a deeper, more personal war happening simultaneously. While the community is judging him from the outside, Anthony is facing a radical transformation of his own internal world. He is forced to confront the ghost of the provider. The realization that the very things he was told would make him a successful man are the very things being used to dismantle his life. How does a man in 2026 reconcile his traditional American upbringing with a reality that seems to punish those very traits? In the next part, we are going to dive into the internal mirror and the death of the provider identity. We will look at the psychological crisis that occurs when a man's utility is stripped away, the reality of post-divorce existentialism, and why the hero's journey narrative we are all sold in the US often fails men in the aftermath of a broken home. We will examine the specific mental health traps that lead to the midlife collapse, and how to navigate the shadow self that emerges when the masks of husband and father are forcibly removed. Prepare yourself, because we are moving from the social battlefield into the deepest parts of the male psyche. The war for your name was just the beginning. The war for your soul is next. The internal mirror is the most brutal part of the 2026 American divorce because it reflects a man whose entire source of light has been extinguished. When the external structures of a life go, the internal world is all that is left, and for many men, that world has been neglected for decades. Imagine Brandon, a 44-year-old logistics manager in Phoenix, Arizona. Brandon grew up in a culture that taught him a simple, relentless equation. Your value as a man is equal to your utility to others. As long as he was providing the paycheck, fixing the broken sink, and acting as the primary protector of the household, Brandon felt like a complete, validated man. When his divorce was finalized in early 2026, that equation was solved with a zero. Brandon sits in a modern, cold apartment in the suburbs of Scottsdale, looking at a set of high-end power tools he bought for a garage he no longer has access to. These tools are no longer instruments of utility. They are silent relics of a dead identity. In the United States, we have a historical trend of defining masculinity through external acquisition and protection. When a man like Brandon loses the context for that protection, he enters what psychologists call a state of ego shattering. The internal mirror is no longer showing him a leader or a provider. It is showing him a man who has been made redundant. This sense of redundancy is the core of the post-divorce existential crisis. If Brandon is not a husband, and if he is only a part-time weekend visiting father, then who is he in the grand scheme of the American story? In 2026, the American cultural script offers almost no answer to this question. There are vibrant narratives of liberation for women and narratives of redirection for the youth, but for the middle-aged divorced man, the script is often a blank, terrifying page. Case studies in male psychology suggest that this blank page is often filled by the shadow self. This is the collection of all the suppressed emotions, the unacknowledged grief, and the deep-seated anger that Brandon was forced to push down to maintain his role during the marriage. Without the structure of the family to hold these emotions in check, the shadow self emerges with a vengeance. For Brandon, this manifests as a sudden, overwhelming sense of institutional betrayal. He feels that he followed all the rules of the American dream. He went to college, he got the job, he stayed faithful, he worked the overtime, and yet the very institutions he supported, from the legal system to his local social circle, have seemingly discarded him. This feeling of being a disposable provider is a psychological weight that the standard healthcare system in the US is often ill-equipped to handle. The data on this psychological state is sobering and demands attention. In the United States, Divorced men are significantly more likely to experience suicidal ideation and depression than married men. This is not just because of the loss of a romantic relationship, it is because of the loss of a mission. The male brain is often mission-oriented, and when that mission is revoked by a court order, the brain begins to cannibalize itself. Brandon finds that the hero's journey narrative he was raised on, the one where the hero faces a trial and returns stronger to his kingdom, seems like a cruel trick. In his 2026 reality, the hero faced a trial, lost half his assets, lost daily contact with his children, and returned to a one-bedroom apartment where the neighbors are strangers. Let us examine the transactional worth trap that dominates the 2026 economy. In a world where everything is a subscription or a service, Brandon's self-worth was also transactional. It was based on what he could do for others. When the divorce happened, he realized that when the transaction ended, so did the appreciation. This realization leads to a profound sense of nihilism. He starts to view his professional achievements as meaningless. Why strive for the next promotion when the salary increase will just be absorbed by increased support payments or a higher tax bracket as a single filer? This professional nihilism is a major contributor to the midlife collapse. We see potential outcomes where men simply quiet quit their entire lives, doing the bare minimum to survive while their internal fire goes out. Furthermore, we must discuss the silence tax. In American culture, men are conditioned from a young age to believe that talking about their internal pain is a sign of fundamental weakness. Brandon's male friends do not know how to handle his grief. They talk about the NFL, they talk about the stock market, and they talk about politics, but they do not talk about the fact that Brandon sits in his car for 20 minutes every night before going into his empty apartment. This lack of an emotional outlet causes the internal mirror to become increasingly distorted. Brandon begins to believe that his pain is unique, that he is fundamentally broken, and that there is no way back to the man he once was. Step by step, the psychological recovery of the American man requires a confrontation with three specific layers of the self. The first step is the death of the provider myth. Brandon must realize that his value as a human being is not tied to his bank account or his title within a household. This is a radical, almost countercultural idea in the USA of 2026, where status is everything. The second step is legitimate grief work. Brandon has to mourn the life he thought he was going to have. Most American men skip this step and try to hustle their way out of the pain, which only leads to a more severe burnout later. The third step is internal validation, where Brandon begins to build a life based on his own internal values, rather than the expectations of a social circle that prove to be conditional. Imagine if Brandon chooses a different path. Instead of succumbing to the shadow, he begins to use the unwanted solitude of his new life to discover who he is outside of the provider cage. He starts to travel, he picks up a hobby like woodworking or long-distance running that was previously suppressed by domestic demands, and he seeks out a new tribe of men who have walked the same path. This is the potential outcome that the American media rarely portrays: the emergence of the sovereign man. He is a man who is whole within himself, regardless of his relationship status or his domestic situation. But the path to becoming sovereign is littered with traps, particularly the digital echo chambers that promise to explain his pain, while actually fueling his long-term resentment. The war for the soul of the American man is won or lost in the quiet, empty hours of a Tuesday night. It is found in the decision to get out of bed, the decision to go to the gym when your body feels like lead, and the decision to keep showing up for your children with a smile, even when it hurts to leave them at a curb at the end of the weekend. The internal mirror is currently showing Brandon a broken man, but that break is actually an opening. It's an opening for a version of himself that is not dependent on the approval of a social system that is designed to prioritize the unit over the individual. However, as Brandon begins to rebuild his internal world, he realizes that the world outside has changed its rules yet again. There is a new emerging social structure in 2026 that is redefining how men interact, how they protect each other, and how they navigate a legal and social system that seems increasingly tilted against them. It is a movement that is moving from the fringes into the mainstream, and it is changing the way divorce is handled before the first paper is ever filed. What is this new brotherhood that is forming in the shadows of the American divorce crisis? How are men using decentralized networks and private agreements to bypass the traditional pitfalls of the family court system? In the next part, we are going to explore the rise of the preemptive man and the alternative social contracts of 2026. We will look at how the next generation of men is viewing marriage, the rise of domestic partnerships over legal marriage, and the secret strategies being used to protect assets and identity, In an era of total digital transparency, the internal war is the foundation, but the strategic war for the future of the American family is just getting started. Prepare for a deep look at the exit strategies that are reshaping the American household forever. The shift we are observing in 2026 is the birth of the preemptive man. This is a demographic of American men who have watched the previous generations undergo the systematic dismantling we have discussed in the first 8 parts of this masterclass, and have decided to re-engineer their approach to the domestic contract entirely. This is not a movement of isolation, but rather a movement of risk-adjusted engagement. These men are looking at the historical trends of the U.S. family court system and the potential outcomes of state-licensed marriage, and they are choosing to bypass the traditional architecture in favor of decentralized, private agreements that prioritize identity sovereignty and asset protection. Imagine Tyler, a 29-year-old financial analyst living in Chicago in early 2026. Tyler is part of a growing cohort of men who view the traditional marriage license not as a romantic milestone, but as a high-risk legal merger with a third party, the state, that has a vested interest in the dissolution process. Tyler has seen his father and his older cousins lose 40 to 60% of their net worth and significant access to their children through the traditional system. Consequently, Tyler's approach to long-term partnership is clinical and structural. He is currently in a committed relationship, but he has opted for what is known in 2026 as the corporate household model. In this model, Tyler and his partner do not sign a state marriage license. Instead, they operate under a series of private cohabitation agreements and cross-linked LLCs. This allows them to define the terms of their partnership, the division of labor, and the potential outcomes of a separation without the interference of a family court judge who might apply broad, outdated statutes to their specific lives. For Tyler, this is about the preservation of the self. By keeping his primary assets, his home, his investment accounts, and his intellectual property in separate legal entities established before the relationship reached a certain level of permanency, he is practicing what sociologists call preemptive guarding. This is a step-by-step process of financial hygiene that is becoming a standard prerequisite for men in high-earning American brackets. Step 1 for the preemptive man is asset segregation. In 2026, men like Tyler are utilizing private trusts and separate property designations with a level of rigor previously reserved for the ultra-wealthy, ensuring that the growth of their premarital assets is not commingled with the daily expenses of the household. Step 2 is the creation of a private domestic contract. These documents often include sunset clauses, where the terms of the agreement are renegotiated every 5 years, and specific mediation requirements that bypass the public court system entirely. Step 3 is the maintenance of separate digital and social identities. Tyler and his partner maintain their own social circles and professional reputations, ensuring that if the partnership ends, the social execution we discussed in Part 7 is structurally impossible. This leads us to the rise of the Living Apart Together or LAT movement in the United States. In 2026, a significant percentage of committed couples are choosing to maintain separate residences, even while being in long-term, monogamous relationships. For the American man, the cultural impact of this is profound. It solves the physical displacement issue at the source. If the relationship ends, there is no battle over who keeps the house because both parties already have their own domestic anchors. Case studies in urban centers like New York and San Francisco show that LAT relationships among men in their 30s and 40s have a higher reported level of satisfaction because they eliminate the domestic friction that often leads to the high-conflict divorce scenarios we have analyzed. The man remains the king of his own castle, and his utility is not tied to the maintenance of a shared, state-monitored household. Furthermore, we must examine the role of relationship wellness AI in 2026. Just as men use apps to track their fitness and finances, they are now using predictive algorithms to monitor the health of their domestic partnerships. These tools analyze communication patterns, frequency of conflict, and external stress markers to provide a real-time risk assessment. Tyler uses an app that alerts him when the communication with his partner is trending toward the defensive or the critical, the two primary indicators of eventual separation. This allows for early intervention and, if necessary, an orderly, non-adversarial exit before the emotional and financial stakes become catastrophic. This is the transition from reactive survival to proactive management. The cultural impact of this shift is the death of the 1950s marriage myth. The next generation of American men is no longer buying into the idea that their primary purpose is to be a disposable provider for a state-sanctioned unit. They are redefining masculinity as the ability to maintain one's own sovereignty while contributing to a partnership on their own terms. We see potential outcomes where this lead to a more honest, albeit less traditional social fabric. In these new arrangements, the man is not an ATM with a visiting pass. He is a voluntary participant in a private agreement. This removes the stoicism tax because the man is no longer performing for a system he doesn't trust. He is building a life that he actually owns. However, we must also look at the case study of the vetting consultancies. In 2026, a new industry has emerged where men hire professional investigators and social auditors to vet potential long-term partners. This goes far beyond a simple background check. It includes an analysis of the potential partner's litigious history, their family's divorce patterns, and their social media footprint. This is the social credit system being used defensively. Men are realizing that in a high-conflict divorce state like the USA, the most important financial and social decision you will ever make is who you choose to bring into your inner circle. By applying the same due diligence to their personal lives that they apply to their professional investments, these men are drastically reducing the probability of a structural collapse. But what about the men who are already in the system? What about those who didn't have the benefit of these 2026 strategies? For them, the path is one of radical reconstruction. They are the ones who must take the broken pieces of their identity and forge something entirely new. This is the transition from the broken provider to the integrated man. It involves a total overhaul of how a man views his labor, his legacy, and his place in the world. It is the most difficult journey an American man can take, but it is also the only way to ensure that the divorce was a beginning rather than an end. As we reach the final stage of this masterclass, we have to ask the ultimate question. After the legal battles are over, after the assets are split, after the health has been reclaimed, and after the social circles have been rebuilt, what remains? How does a man in the United States actually thrive in a culture that seems designed to extract his value? In the final part, we are going to explore the ultimate legacy of the divorced man. We will look at the rise of the new paternalism, the way men are bypassing traditional family structures to mentor the next generation, and the specific steps to achieving total psychological and financial freedom. We will reveal the blueprint for the second act. A life that is more powerful, more authentic, and more secure than the one that was lost. The masterclass concludes with the map to the summit. Prepare for the final integration. The final integration begins with a radical reassessment of what it means to be a successful man in the United States after the traditional structures have failed. In this masterclass, we have deconstructed the legal, financial, and social traps that characterize the American divorce experience. Now we must build the blueprint for the sovereign man of 2026. This is not about returning to a previous version of yourself. It is about synthesizing the trauma into a new, more resilient identity that is no longer dependent on external validation or the state-sanctioned role of the provider. Imagine Chris, a 52-year-old former executive in Denver. It is late 2026, and Chris has completed the 3-year cycle of post-divorce reconstruction. In the initial stages, Chris felt the weight of the displacement we discussed in Part 2. He felt the sting of the social execution in Part 7. But today, Chris represents the potential outcomes of a man who has successfully navigated the final integration. He has moved beyond the survival phase and entered the stage of sovereign living. The first step in Chris's map to the summit was the total decoupling of his worth from his utility. In the US, historical trends have conditioned men to believe they are only as good as the problems they solve for others. Chris had to systematically dismantle this belief. He began by auditing his daily labor. He realized that for 20 years, his professional drive was fueled by the need to maintain a domestic architecture that eventually collapsed. By decoupling his identity from that architecture, Chris found that his work became more focused, less stressful, and ironically more profitable. He moved from being a mercenary for a household to being a master of his own craft. This leads to the second step of the integration, the biological and environmental reboot. In 2026, the American health landscape is increasingly focused on longevity and cellular health. Chris did not just go to the gym to look better on dating apps. He engaged in a data-driven health protocol to counteract the allostatic load we detailed in Part 3. He utilized wearable technology to monitor his cortisol levels and sleep architecture, realizing that the quiet of his new life was actually his greatest asset for recovery. He transformed his living space from a temporary apartment into a high-performance sanctuary. In this environment, Chris is not a visitor. He is the architect. Every object in his home serves his personal growth and recovery. This physical sovereignty is the foundation upon which his new life is built. Case studies of men like Chris in the mid-2020s show a common pivot toward what we call the new paternalism. This is the third step of the map. In Part 4, we looked at the custody architecture and the pain of the visitor role. Chris realized that while he couldn't control the quantity of time with his children, he could radically improve the quality and the nature of his influence. He stopped trying to be the fun dad who provides entertainment and started being the mentor dad who provides a roadmap. He began teaching his children the very things this masterclass has covered: emotional intelligence, financial sovereignty, and the importance of private contracts. He realized that his legacy is not the house they grew up in, but the strength of the character he models for them now. This shift from provider to mentor changed the dynamic from one of loss to one of transmission. His children now see a father who is whole, directed, and independent, which is a far more powerful lesson than a father who is merely a stressed-out participant in a traditional domestic unit. Fourth, we must address the reconstruction of the tribe. Social execution Chris faced was actually a filtering mechanism. Historical trends indicate that the friends who remain after a high-conflict divorce are the ones who value the man's character over his social status. In 2026, Chris has built a new circle of peers, men who have also navigated the transition and who operate on a basis of radical honesty and mutual support. This is the decentralized tribe. They do not meet for superficial socialization. They meet for strategic collaboration and emotional accountability. This tribe provides the social safety net that the U.S. state and traditional suburban culture fail to offer. Within this group, Chris's name is not managed by a whisper network. It is held in high regard by men who have seen his scars and respect his recovery. Financial sovereignty in 2026 requires a postmortem of the two-household tax. Chris's final step to the summit was the implementation of a lean, mobile wealth strategy. Instead of chasing the next large real estate investment that could be subject to future litigation, he focused on liquid assets, geographically diversified investments, and intellectual property. He moved away from the consumerist trap of the American middle class, realizing that the less he owns that can be seized or divided, the more power he actually has. This financial agility allowed him to take risks in his career that he never would have taken while tethered to a traditional marriage. The potential outcome is a level of wealth and security that is built on a foundation of reality, rather than the illusion of domestic permanence. But there is one final, deeper layer to this integration: the peace of the unshackled mind. Chris realized that the divorce was not a failure of his life, but a failure of a specific social contract that was no longer serving his growth or growth of his partner. In the US, we are sold a narrative of failure that is designed to keep us compliant. By rejecting that narrative, Chris achieved a state of psychological freedom that most married men never touch. He is no longer living in fear of the next domestic argument, the next legal threat, or the next social rejection. He has faced the worst the system could throw at him, and he is still standing. This is the true summit of the masterclass. Step by step, we have mapped the cultural impact of divorce for men in the USA. We have looked at the health costs, the financial erosion, the social displacement, and the psychological warfare. But we have also seen the emergence of a new kind of man. A man who is informed, strategic, and sovereign. If you are currently in the valley, looking up at the summit Chris has reached, know that the path is predictable. It requires a ruthless commitment to the truth, a willingness to let go of the provider identity, and the courage to build a new tribe from the ashes of the old. The masterclass ends here, but your second act is just beginning. You now have the vocabulary to describe your experience and the framework to navigate the hurdles. You are no longer a victim of a system you don't understand. You are a student of a reality you are learning to master. The cultural impact of divorce in America is a transformation. And while the fire is hot, the metal that emerges is harder, sharper, and more refined. But even as you reach the summit, a new question arises on the horizon. While you have mastered the exit and the reconstruction, how does the next generation of men view the very concept of commitment in a world where the traditional models have clearly broken? Are we witnessing the end of the American family as we know it, or the birth of a more honest, more resilient version of human partnership? In our upcoming special series, we are going to dive into the data on the 2027 and 2028 partnership trends. We will look at the rise of the intentional community, the future of male-led households, and how the definition of home is being rewritten by the very men the system tried to erase. The journey of the sovereign man never truly ends. It only expands into new territories. Prepare for the next phase of the American evolution.